Look at this face. Really look at it. This is Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, and possibly the most genetically destroyed human being to ever sit on a throne. His jaw jutted out so far he couldn't chew food properly. His tongue was so swollen it barely fit in his mouth. He drooled constantly, spoke in mumbles, and had seizures that made his eyes roll back into his skull. But here's the thing that'll make your skin crawl. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some random tragedy. Charles II was deliberately created by his own royal family through centuries of inbreeding so intense it would make your family reunions look normal. This is the story of how one family's obsession with bloodline purity created a monster, destroyed an empire, and ended a dynasty. This is the story of Charles II, the bewitched king whose body was both the crown jewel and the tombstone of Habsburg Spain. November 6, 1661, Madrid. The Queen is screaming, but something's wrong. Royal births are usually celebrated with cannon fire and church bells. This time, there's only silence. The midwives are whispering. The doctors are backing away from the bed. What they're looking at isn't a prince. It's barely human. His father, Philip IV, is brought in to see his heir. The king stares at the infant for a long moment, then quietly leaves the room. Court physicians huddle together, speaking in hushed tones about curses and divine punishment. Some suggest the child should be allowed to die naturally. Others whisper that perhaps it would be merciful, but Charles survives that first night, and the next. Somehow, this broken little body clings to life with a determination that seems almost supernatural. The wet nurses struggle to feed him because his jaw won't align properly. Milk dribbles from his mouth constantly. He makes strange gurgling sounds instead of normal baby cries. Within weeks, the Spanish court realizes they have a problem. The heir to the largest empire in the world can't even suckle properly. Ambassadors from other kingdoms are asking questions. How do you present a prince who looks like nature's mistake? The answer is simple. You lie. By his first birthday, it's clear that Charles isn't developing normally. Other royal children his age are walking, making sounds, showing curiosity about the world. Charles just lies there, his oversized head lolling to one side, his mouth hanging open, drool pooling on whatever surface he's placed on. The Habsburg dynasty, which had dominated European politics for centuries, had finally produced its masterpiece. A king so deformed that his own body would become the symbol of everything wrong with absolute monarchy and aristocratic inbreeding. Charles II wasn't born to rule. He was born to end it all. Before we move on, we want to thank you for listening. We really like making these videos and would highly appreciate it if you subscribe to our channel. Thank you. Let's move on. To understand Charles II, you need to understand the Habsburg family tree. Except it's not really a tree. It's more like a twisted knot of genetic material that loops back on itself over and over again. For over 200 years, the Habsburgs had been marrying their own relatives to keep wealth and power in the family. What they got instead was Charles. His parents, Philip IV and Maria Anna of Austria, were uncle and niece. Not distant relatives who happened to share a great-great-grandfather. Uncle and niece. Maria Anna was the daughter of Philip's brother. The same blood running through both parents, now concentrated and amplified in their son. But it gets worse. Go back another generation, and you'll find Charles's grandparents were first cousins. His great-grandparents, also related. Keep tracing those bloodlines backward, and the same names keep appearing. Charles V, Ferdinand I, Maximilian II. The same genetic material recycled over and over, like a photocopy of a photocopy, until the image becomes completely distorted. Modern geneticists have calculated Charles's inbreeding coefficient. It's higher than what you'd expect from a brother and sister having a child together. Think about that. The Habsburgs had managed to create a genetic situation worse than direct sibling incest through sheer persistence and royal stubbornness. Charles II wasn't just a king. He was a science experiment conducted over centuries by a family too arrogant to admit they were destroying themselves. Every seizure, every moment of confusion, every day he struggled to perform basic human functions was proof that the Habsburg dynasty had finally gone too far. By the time Charles was born, the damage was irreversible. The Spanish Empire was being ruled by a genetic catastrophe, and everyone knew it. Most children learn to walk by their first birthday. Charles II was 4 years old when he finally managed to stumble across a room without falling. His legs were weak, his balance non-existent, and his oversized head made every movement a struggle against gravity. Speaking came even later. While other royal children were chattering away in multiple languages by age 3, Charles could barely make recognizable sounds until he was 8. His swollen tongue, his malformed jaw, and his general confusion about the world around him turned every attempt at communication into a frustrating ordeal. His tutors tried everything. They brought in the best teachers in Europe, men who had successfully educated princes and nobles across the continent. With Charles, they hit a wall. He couldn't focus for more than a few minutes at a time. He couldn't remember lessons from one day to the next. Reading remained a mystery to him throughout his entire life. Court records from this period paint a disturbing picture. At age 10, Charles was described as having the mental capacity of a 5-year-old. At 15, observers noted that he still played with toys and seemed confused by basic concepts that children half his age understood easily. His physical appearance was equally disturbing. As he grew older, the Habsburg deformities became more pronounced. His jaw jutted out so far that his upper and lower teeth couldn't meet. Eating solid food was nearly impossible. He had to survive on liquids and soft foods that could be. The Spanish court tried to hide Charles's condition from foreign ambassadors, but it was impossible. When diplomatic visitors were granted audiences with the teenage king, they left shocked by what they had seen. Reports filtered back to other European capitals, describing a royal heir who seemed barely human. What made it worse was Charles's awareness of his own condition. He wasn't completely mentally disabled. He understood that he was different, that people stared at him with disgust and pity. He knew that his body was failing him, that he couldn't do things that came naturally to everyone else around him. Court physicians had no idea how to help him. Medical knowledge in the 17th century was primitive at best, and Charles's condition was beyond anything they had encountered. They tried bloodletting, purging, and various herbal remedies. Nothing worked. If anything, their treatments made him weaker. By his late teens, it was clear that Charles II would never be the kind of king Spain needed. He was a perpetual child trapped in an increasingly broken adult body, destined to rule an empire he could barely comprehend. When Charles II officially became king at age 4, after his father's death, everyone knew he couldn't actually rule. What they didn't anticipate was just how long this charade would continue. For over 3 decades, Spain was governed by a king who couldn't govern himself. His mother, Maria Anna, became regent and the real power behind the throne. She made decisions, signed documents, and met with ministers while Charles sat in his oversized royal chair, drooling and staring blankly at whoever was speaking. The young king had become a living symbol rather than an actual ruler. As Charles grew older, different factions at court tried to control him. Ministers would whisper in his ear, trying to get him to agree to policies he couldn't understand. Religious figures convinced him that his condition was divine punishment for his family's sins. Foreign ambassadors learned to bring gifts and speak slowly, hoping to gain his favor through simple manipulation. The most disturbing aspect was how Charles was used in public ceremonies. He would be dressed in elaborate royal robes, propped up on his throne, and displayed to crowds who had come to see their king. His handlers would move his hands to wave at the right moments, position his head so he appeared to be paying attention, and quickly whisk him away when he started having seizures or other episodes. Cabinet meetings became surreal performances. Ministers would present complex political issues to a king who couldn't follow basic conversations. Charles would nod at random moments, make incomprehensible sounds, or simply stare off into space, while crucial decisions about the Spanish Empire were made around him. The bureaucracy adapted by creating a system where Charles's approval was assumed rather than actually obtained. Documents were signed with his seal by trusted advisors. Royal decrees were issued in his name without his knowledge or understanding. The entire government learned to function despite having a king who was essentially absent from his own reign. What made it even more tragic was that Charles seemed to understand, on some levels, that he was being used. Court observers noted moments when he would look confused or upset during official ceremonies, as if he realized that something was wrong, but couldn't articulate what it was. The Spanish Empire, once the most powerful force in Europe, was being ruled by a broken man who needed help eating his meals. Every day that Charles remained on the throne was another day that Spain slipped further behind its rivals. The puppet king was presiding over the collapse of his own empire, too damaged to understand what was happening and too weak to stop it. By his 20s, Charles II had become something that made people cross themselves when they saw him. His appearance was so disturbing that courtiers whispered he wasn't just deformed, he was possessed by demons. Looking at the King of Spain had become an act of courage. The drooling had gotten worse. His tongue, too large for his mouth, hung out almost constantly. Saliva ran down his chin in steady streams, soaking through multiple layers of clothing every day. The smell that surrounded him was a mixture of stale saliva, unwashed flesh, and the various medications his doctors forced him to take. His eyes were the worst part. They would roll back into his head without warning, showing only the whites while his body convulsed. During these seizures, he would make horrible gurgling sounds, and his limbs would jerk uncontrollably. Anyone who witnessed these episodes came away convinced they had seen something supernatural and evil. Charles's skin had a grayish, unhealthy color that made him look like a walking corpse. His hair was thin and greasy, falling out in patches. His body was so weak that he could barely walk across a room without assistance. At 30 years old, he looked like a man of 70, and a sick 70 at that. The Habsburg jaw had become so pronounced that it affected his speech beyond recognition. When Charles tried to talk, the sounds that came out were barely human. Most people couldn't understand him at all. He would gesture frantically, trying to communicate, but the words were just wet, incomprehensible noises. Exorcisms were performed regularly. Priests would chant over Charles while he writhed and moaned, convinced they were battling supernatural forces for his soul. These sessions often made his condition worse, but the religious authorities insisted they were necessary to save both the king and the kingdom. Foreign visitors who met Charles came away traumatized. One French ambassador wrote that seeing the Spanish king was like looking into hell itself. An Italian diplomat described Charles as a creature that God should never have allowed to live. These weren't diplomatic insults. They were honest reactions to encountering something that seemed to defy nature. The Spanish Empire needed an heir, which meant Charles II had to get married and produce children. The problem was obvious to everyone except the people making these decisions. Charles could barely take care of himself, let alone perform the basic biological functions required for reproduction. His first wife was Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess who was reportedly beautiful, intelligent, and completely unprepared for what awaited her in Madrid. The marriage negotiations were conducted normally, with both sides pretending that Charles was a typical royal husband, rather than a genetic catastrophe who couldn't speak clearly or control his bodily functions. The wedding night was a disaster that became the subject of hushed conversations throughout European courts. Marie-Louise emerged from the royal chambers in tears, and Charles was found the next morning having one of his seizures. Court physicians were called in, but there was nothing they could do to make Charles's body function normally. For 10 years, Marie-Louise tried to fulfill her duty as queen. She endured Charles's presence, his unpredictable behavior, his physical repulsiveness, and the constant pressure from court officials demanding that she produce an heir. The marriage was never consummated in any meaningful way. Charles's deformities made normal sexual function impossible. Doctors blamed everything except the obvious. They suggested that Charles was under a curse that prevented him from fathering children. They performed bizarre medical procedures, trying to stimulate his reproductive system with herbs, bloodletting, and painful treatments that only made him sicker. Religious authorities convinced Charles that his inability to have children was divine punishment for his family's sins. They subjected him to increasingly extreme forms of penance, including self-flagellation and prolonged fasting that weakened his already fragile body even further. Marie Louise's death in 1689 was officially attributed to illness, but court gossip suggested she had been poisoned. Others whispered that she had died of despair, unable to bear another day of her grotesque marriage to a man who was more monster than human. Charles's second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg was equally unsuccessful. The new queen arrived in Madrid expecting to fulfill her duty as a royal wife and mother. Instead, she found herself married to a man who couldn't eat solid food without assistance and had seizures in the middle of conversations. The pressure to produce an heir became overwhelming. Spanish nobles, church leaders, and foreign allies all demanded that Charles somehow father a child to continue the Habsburg line. When it became clear that this was impossible, they started looking for someone to blame. Some accused the queens of being infertile or cursed. Others suggested that foreign enemies were using black magic to prevent Charles from reproducing. The most desperate courtiers proposed that Charles should take a mistress, or that his wives should be impregnated by other men and claim the children were his. Charles himself seemed to understand that his failure to produce children was somehow his fault, but he couldn't comprehend why. He would become agitated when the subject was raised, making his horrible gurgling sounds and gesturing frantically at his own body, as if trying to explain something he didn't have the words for. The Spanish succession crisis was building, and everyone knew it. Without an heir from Charles, the Spanish Empire would eventually be carved up by other European powers. The king's broken body wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a national catastrophe that would reshape the entire continent. Charles II didn't die suddenly. He rotted away over decades while still breathing, his body failing piece by piece in a grotesque display that horrified everyone who witnessed it. By his 30s, he had become a living anatomy lesson in how badly the human form could malfunction. His teeth, what few remained, were black and broken. The constant drooling had created permanent sores around his mouth that never healed properly. His gums were infected and bleeding, giving his breath a smell so foul that servants had to hold perfumed cloths over their faces when attending to him. The seizures were getting worse and more frequent. What had started as occasional episodes in childhood had become daily occurrences that left Charles unconscious and convulsing on the floor. His handlers learned to clear furniture from his path and keep soft materials nearby to prevent him from injuring himself during these attacks. His digestive system was failing. Charles could barely keep food in his stomach, and what little he did manage to swallow often came back up within hours. He was slowly starving to death despite having access to the finest foods in Europe. His body had become so damaged that it couldn't perform the basic function of nutrition. Court physicians tried increasingly desperate treatments. They bled him regularly, purged his system with harsh laxatives, and forced him to drink various concoctions that were supposed to restore his health. These treatments only accelerated his decline, weakening his already fragile body even further. His mental state deteriorated along with his physical condition. Charles would spend hours staring at nothing, completely unresponsive to the world around him. When he did react to stimuli, it was often with confusion or terror, as if he couldn't understand where he was or what was happening to him. The smell surrounding Charles became so overwhelming that special protocols were developed for anyone who had to interact with him. Servants burned incense constantly in his chambers. His clothes were changed multiple times per day. Nothing helped. The stench of his decaying body penetrated everything around him. His hair fell out in clumps, leaving him nearly bald by age 35. His skin became so pale and translucent that you could see the veins underneath. He looked like a corpse that someone had forgotten to bury, propped up in royal robes and displayed as a mockery of kingship. Spanish nobles started making secret plans for what would happen after Charles's death. Everyone knew the end was coming, and the only question was whether the kingdom would survive the transition. The king's slow-motion death had become a metaphor for the decline of the entire Spanish Empire. By 1700, Charles II was barely alive. His body had failed in every possible way, yet somehow he continued breathing. The final Habsburg king was dying as he had lived, slowly, publicly, and as a warning to anyone who believed that royal blood was somehow superior to ordinary human genetics. Charles II died on November 1st, 1700, and with him died the Spanish Habsburg dynasty that had dominated Europe since the 1500s. His death wasn't mourning, it was relief. The nightmare was finally over, and Spain could begin the difficult process of recovering from 3 centuries of genetic self-destruction. The autopsy was performed by the royal physicians, and what they found inside Charles's body was so shocking that their report became legendary throughout European medical circles. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were putrid and gangrenous. His kidneys contained only a single drop of blood. Most disturbing of all, Charles had only one testicle, and it was completely black. The physicians concluded that it would have been impossible for him to father children, even if he had been mentally and physically capable of normal sexual function. The Spanish succession crisis hadn't been caused by bad luck or divine punishment. It was the inevitable result of Charles's malformed body. His brain, when examined, was found to be filled with water instead of normal tissue. The doctors couldn't understand how Charles had survived, as long as he did, with such massive internal damage. One physician wrote that Charles's body was so corrupted that it seemed impossible for him to have lived even a single day. The Spanish people reacted to Charles's death with a mixture of grief and celebration. They mourned the end of their royal dynasty, but they also celebrated the end of an embarrassing chapter in their nation's history. Foreign courts, which had spent decades watching Charles's grotesque reign with fascination and horror, expressed diplomatic sympathy while privately rejoicing that the spectacle was finally over. Charles had named Philip of Anjou, Louis XIV's grandson, as his heir in his will. This decision sparked the War of Spanish Succession, as other European powers refused to accept French control over the Spanish Empire. The continent erupted in conflict, fighting over the remains of what Charles's broken body had destroyed. The Habsburg jaw, which had grown more pronounced with each generation, died with Charles. The genetic line that had produced this deformity was finally extinct. Modern geneticists consider Charles II to be one of the most extreme examples of inbreeding depression in recorded history. His death marked the end of an era in European politics. The age of Habsburg dominance was over, replaced by a new balance of power that would shape the continent for centuries to come. Charles's broken body had accomplished what no army or diplomatic alliance could achieve. It had brought down one of history's greatest empires from the inside. The Spanish court, that had spent decades hiding Charles's condition from the world, finally admitted the truth. Official documents acknowledged that the king had been mentally and physically disabled throughout his reign. The elaborate charade that had propped up his rule for 35 years was finally abandoned. Charles II was buried with the traditional pomp and ceremony due to a Spanish king, but everyone knew they were burying more than just a man. They were burying the evidence of what happens when royal families become so obsessed with bloodline purity that they destroy themselves through genetic isolation. The most fitting epitaph for Charles II came from a French diplomat who wrote, "The Catholic king is dead, and with him dies the proof that God has a sense of humor, for he allowed this creature to live 39 years and rule the greatest empire in the world." The bewitched king had finally found peace, and Europe could finally look away from the horror of what the Habsburgs had created. If you came this far, make sure to click the next video that's on the screen right now. Subscribe to stay engaged for more content.